you to know that DOC has established partnership with ESCAP, which is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and also the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Basically, the partnership with ESCAP was to produce a research paper on the regional cooperation for structural economic transformation towards sustainable development in the countries participated in SPECA, which is the special program for the economies of Central Asia. And the results of the project were presented in the 2018 SPECA Economic Forum in Almaty, Kazakhstan. The second partnership, which was with the Food and Agriculture Organization, in the second partnership, we developed a research policy on the scenario building for food and agricultural development in the Central Asian countries. And the outcome of the research projects were 2 papers, in which one has been published in the DOC Research Institute publication series, and the other one is still under publication. In a nutshell, in one of the papers that has been published, and I would like you to check whenever you have time, was about the changes in the geographical structure of trade in Central Asia, which says that trade has collapsed within the countries of former Soviet Union and has increased with China and then the rest of the Asian countries. And the outcome of the research project that has been done for ESCAP, the outcome reveals that the economic miracle does not occur by agricultural development, but by manufacturing export orientation policy. That's all. Thank you very much.
Hello? Well, it was? Okay. Dear friends, dear colleagues, we'll start our panel about Middle East, about the conflict, not only in Syria, but in generally in the region. What we want, how we see our panel. I think we give 5 minutes to each of our participants to express their positions, their views, and then I think it will be more productive if we go through discussion. Some questions, commentary, because we think the discussion is much more interesting and, let me say, exciting than academic presentations. Before we start, we'll try to present our personal visions concerning the situation in the Middle East and Syria, of course. 2 minutes if each of us. Well, maybe I'll tell you some provocative things, but it seems sometimes it's necessary. So, my 2 minutes. First of all, I don't believe that very soon or even soon we should be able to find a final solution of the conflict. It's impossible. It will continue because of the domestic internal problem within Syria itself and because of participation in this conflict several countries. Point number 1. Point number 1.5. I don't know why, but it seems to me that in post-Assad period, or in generally, the factor, the problem of Islamism, of political Islam, will stay very actual. And practically, I'm sure in the next regime after Bashar al-Assad, Islamists will participate in state building, I would say. By the way, I don't know if Syria is able to keep its entity. This is point number one. Point number two. Today, while yesterday and in the future we spoke and we continue to talk about multilaterality, it's very difficult to pronounce, or multipolarity. I support this idea, I support this slogan, but I don't know what is it. If you ask me to describe what does it mean in practice, I don't know. Why I mentioned this problem? Because it seems that the crisis in Syria, this is a crisis emerged, created, and which will develop in this in multipolarity situation. Too many polars, too many participants. So, and my last point, because I promised 2 minutes, due to all this, and a lot multipolarity and Islamism and so on, I can admit that in a couple of years maybe, or even sooner, we could name some crisis as a Middle Eastern, some crisis number 2. Everybody knows about number 1. Now we assist, it's my private opinion, I repeat, maybe I'm mistaken. Now we assist at the emergence and prolongation of a crisis in the Middle East, number 2. It's not forever, but it's for a long time. Thank you for your attention, and now
Thank you. Thank you, Alexei.
Some your 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Elon Levy. I'm a news anchor and correspondent at I24 News. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize for participating in such a respectable panel wearing jeans. At GN Airlines managed to lose my suitcase, so while you were all working on a dialogue of civilizations this morning, I was working on a dialogue of airports. The late, great Israeli statesman Shimon Peres, when speaking of political solutions, was fond of saying that while one can make an omelette from an egg, one can't make an egg from an omelette. And what I think he was trying to say was that it's much easier to break something and create a mess than to fix it. And after years of brutal upheaval in the Middle East, I think most people agree that this regional scrambled egg or regional omelette cannot be turned back into a box of eggs. So the question that we want to discuss with our panel today is, if these conflicts cannot be solved, and they cannot go on forever either, then what's next? One of the most influential and controversial books in Israel last year was a book called Catch 67 by Micha Goodman. And at the heart of Catch 67 is one provocative question. What if the conflict cannot be solved? What if there is no magic solution that both sides can agree on, implement, and see through? What if for Israel a full withdrawal from the West Bank would be every bit the same existential threat as remaining in control of those territories? What if that conflict cannot be solved? And for many policymakers and diplomats, it's taken as an unspoken assumption, an axiom almost, that every conflict, every problem has a solution. But what if that's not the case? Catch 67 proposes a radical new paradigm. It says, instead of thinking about ending the conflict or managing the conflict, perhaps what Israelis need to start thinking about is trying to shrink the conflict instead. And shrinking the conflict means not pinning our hopes on a big, comprehensive solution that will make the conflict go away once and for all. It means taking pragmatic actions, small steps that will begin the process of separation between Israelis and Palestinians, doing absolutely everything possible to minimize the occupation and its interference in Palestinians' lives without reducing Israeli security in parallel. Goodman uses a medical analogy to try to explain what he means by shrinking the conflict. He says, some diseases like HIV/AIDS are incurable, but they don't have to be fatal, because medical science can make incurable conditions non-lethal. It can make them chronic, something you can live with instead. And perhaps the same is true of political science. There might not be comprehensive solutions that can democratize Syria or stabilize Yemen or fulfill the Kurds' demands for self-determination. So perhaps diplomats and policymakers can instead explore creative accommodations that can help to shrink those conflicts, to minimize them, and make those realities more livable and more tolerable for everyone else instead. Peace and conflict in this thinking are not binary options. There is always a measure of peace in the world and a measure of conflict, and the challenge is to try to maximize the peace and to minimize the conflict. So in this panel, we want to try to brainstorm some of those questions. Can the conflict in the Middle East be solved, or can they only be shrunk? What realistic options are there to try to shrink those conflicts, especially in the context of the era of Donald Trump and the fraying liberal Western order? And what does it mean to start planning for a future in which we accept that those conflicts are probably going to survive and persist, but will have been transformed into chronic conditions instead? So with that, I'd like to turn over to our panel now. We'd like to give everyone up to 5 minutes. 5 minutes, please, to make some introductory remarks, preliminary thoughts about conflicts in the Middle East, each from their own respective fields, and start thinking about creative ways those can be addressed. So without further delay, I'm very happy to pass over to Mr. Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Mr. Olmert.
Thank you very much. Well, now that we have learned how long can 2 minutes be, we'll bear it in mind regarding the 5 minutes limitations. I have to apologize in advance that due to some acoustic problems here, when you sit in the hall, you can understand what the speakers here speak. So I hope they will all understand us. But when you sit here, you don't understand anything that you guys speak, and I guess that they don't understand what we will be speaking. So just, you know, this is something that I hope will be resolved while I speak. Now, at the beginning, I saw the introduction on writing for this panel. The one impossible solution for the paradigm of conflict in the Middle East. And I want to say that there is one possible solution. There is only one possible solution, and this is a two-state solution. There can be no other, and against all the analysis and expert opinions that I keep hearing all the time, I personally believe that this solution is not only the only possible solution. This solution is achievable, is doable, and can be implemented within a relatively short period of time. But what it requires first and foremost is a determined leadership on both sides, which is the Israeli and the Palestinian, that will have a firm commitment to move forward towards such a solution. Is this the case right now? I'm not certain. And I don't want to share now the blame between the sides, but to the best of my understanding, knowledge, and conviction, this is the only possible solution. And it is both doable and achievable within a short period of time if the leaderships of the two sides will have the courage, the determination, and the commitment to move forward against perhaps the initial expectations of some of their constituents, but in the best interests of the long-range needs of both nations. Now, I recently heard that President Trump is going to present his peace plan. I am not familiar with the details of this peace plan. I'm not sure that I know what it is. I have no idea what they have elaborated in Washington. But I'm very, very happy that the President is prepared to connect his name to a peace plan. He could have said that this is a peace plan of the State Department. He could have said that this is a peace plan of Jason Greenblatt, the special emissary. No, it is called by the United States the Trump Plan for Peace in the Middle East, which means that the president is prepared to link his own name to a peace plan. Now, why is it important? I don't know Trump, I have to admit. I may have met him, I don't know, years back, but I don't know him. But there is one thing evident about him which no one can miss. If there is one thing which he hates, or rather one thing which he is absolutely in love with, is that he will not be linked with any failure. If he is prepared to have his name on a peace plan called the Trump peace plan, then it shows that maybe he has some confidence that it has a chance. Now, I can't believe that such a plan will not be based on the two-state solution. There can be no solution if it's not a two-state solution. So there is a chance that there are at least two people in the world which believe that peace is possible. One is President Trump, who is prepared to link his name to a peace plan. And humbly, if I may say, the other one is myself. I had the distinct honor of spending some time with President Mahmoud Abbas. Yeah, I learned from you what 2 minutes can last, so don't worry. My 5 minutes will be shorter than yours too. I talked at length with Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. We agreed that 9 years ago, when we were negotiating, we were that close to conclude a deal. It didn't work out. We may have needed another 3-4 months, as he said, for me to be in the prime ministership in order to conclude this deal, but we were very close to it. And what is important is that I could understand from what President Abbas said to me, and further said publicly to television, is that the framework which was proposed by me on behalf of the State of Israel to the Palestinians has never been rejected by him, which means that it still can be the basis, and perhaps the only basis, for an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And finally, I want to say this. As I said before, there is no other solution. There is only one solution, not many, not variations, only one solution, a two-state solution. And this is urgent because it can be the basis of a comprehensive, dramatic, maybe historic change in the Middle East, and perhaps far more than just the Middle East. An agreement between Israel and the Palestinians is a key to stabilize the Middle East, to change the parameters of the present situation completely, to create a partnership, open, official, public, economic, military, effective partnership between all the moderate countries in the Middle East. And Israel is at the center with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, with Jordan, with the Emirates, with Bahrain, with Kuwait, with all these others, moderate Arab countries, and it can create a momentum that will influence the politics of the world at large. Thank you.
Microphone on, Mr. Omar, thank you very much. Our next guest is Ambassador Rajendra Abhyankar, 37 years experience in the Indian diplomatic service, now a professor at Indiana University. Ambassador, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to listen to you, Prime Minister. I do hope the two-state plan will work, because I have seen, I've read at least, that the Palestinians are not entirely happy with the way it has been formulated at the present moment. Maybe it will change. But I do not want to dwell on this. What I wanted to say was talk about Syria, because we are here talking about making multilateralism work. The way multilateralism can work is if it is beneficial and if it is inclusive, because a speaker in the plenary session said that multilateralism was a Western idea. So are we now still going after multilateralism as a Western idea, or multilateralism as an inclusive idea which brings all the countries of the world in it? It has to be inclusive, therefore, and it has to be beneficial. And Syria is an outstanding example and a current example for the last 8 years of why multilateralism is negative and disruptive. Because 4 of the 5 members, permanent members of the Security Council are involved not only in terms of their objective, but on the ground in Syria. And that is why you find that there is no agreement whatsoever on the Security Council, in the Security Council, on bringing peace to that country. Neither has there been any kind of a UN resolution allowing them to do it. That being said, today we are at a situation where there is only one province, the Idlib province in Syria, which is still disputed. But now is the time for the international community, as we understand it today, to put their minds together to look at the problems which need to be settled. These are the whole business of refugees. There are more than 13 million Syrians displaced within the country and almost 5 million outside the country. There is the question of terrorism, which has now spread all across Europe. There is, of course, the interest of major powers, but there is a need to build a governance in that country which will be, again, inclusive, which will protect the minorities, but which will also accept the fact that the Sunnis are in majority in that country. Now, I would say that in one way, Russia has helped, Russia's participation on the side of President Assad has helped to see that the country doesn't get disunited and fragmented. So in that, Russia has been quite instrumental, with Iran of course, to make this happen since 2013. I feel that maybe Russia in the Security Council should look at the possibility of bringing some balance into the imbalance of forces or imbalance of powers that were again referred to by one of the speakers in the last session, that imbalance, the absolute illustration of that imbalance in the Security Council is what's happening in Syria. So if Russia was instrumental in bringing the country back and seeing it is not fragmented, because please don't forget, it's the only country in the world where minorities, whether they are Christians or other sects of Islam, are still living there and living in peace compared to the rest of the Middle East. So there's a huge time, expense, and agreement that will be required to rebuild that country into as close as possible to what it was. I would say that there is a need to do it, not only to curb the forces of extremism and terrorism that lie at the root of this. It is also instrumental to do it because the example of Syria is equally valid in many other countries which have a multiplicity of religions, ethnicities, and culture. I can give India's example. We have, at any given time, we have 6 insurgencies going on. Our whole struggle has been to bring these insurgent groups into the national mainstream. But that's a tough business to do. It's lucky for the time being that they are not getting any support from outside, but think that if a lot of people, a lot of countries started supporting them, we would be probably in a worse situation than Syria, because we have 1 billion people against 23 million people in Syria. So it has an international implication which is important to keep in mind. Finally, I would just say that as far as Syria is concerned, the effort...
Ambassador, if you could wrap up.
1 minute.
Thank you. 1 minute's fine.
That what lies at the root is not just the problem of imbalance within the permanent members of the Security Council. What lies at the second level of the conflict that goes on in Syria is the conflict within Islam between Shias and Sunnis. This is a conflict as old as history, but it needs to be settled in some way, and for that, perhaps the organization of Islamic Conference organization could be useful. Perhaps even the DOC could think of working with them. But both have to be tackled at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Frank Malou is the CEO of I24 News, an international news network broadcasting in English, French, and Arabic from Tel Aviv. He is also a former French civil servant with a background in press relations and public diplomacy. Frank.
Thank you, Elon. When you're working in the media, you see how much the media are important, especially in the way you are covering certain regions in the world. And it's very interesting to see in the talk show, coming every day, every evening, specialists, analysts, coming to explain that all the time the world has changed. They are all the time saying, yes, but the world has changed. But they are not saying that the world is still changing, and at the moment they are speaking, it's still moving. And when we are talking about the Middle East, it's very important to understand that things have changed, but things are changing a lot. Elon, you said a few minutes ago that every problem has a solution, so my recommendation is to start to see the Middle East no more as a problem, but as a solution. And for that, we need to have the global picture, and to understand the global picture. If you want to understand the complexity of the Middle East, you need to offer the global picture. And when you have the global picture, it's very interesting to see that there is a difference of perception. If you are outside the Middle East, you have one perception. Everything is stuck. If you are living inside the Middle East, you have another perception. And I think today, as said Mr. Prime Minister Olmert, we are at a crossroad. It could be an opportunity to make peace. Things are changing. The countries in the Middle East are watching each other in a different way because they have common interest. They have common interest in the way to manage Iran. They have common interest in the way to manage Syria. They have common interest in the way to manage Yemen. And I really think, as a former diplomat, especially French, you heard this morning Dominique de Villepin, who was my teacher, I don't believe in a bilateral peace plan because they don't have any interest, Israeli or Palestinian, to do a deal together alone. The Israelis want the status quo, And the Palestinians, they are existing through the fight and the battle against the Israelis. I don't believe also in a big international plan, because as I said, there is a huge gap of perception, especially in Europe, about what's going on in the Middle East and the way of the countries in the Middle East are feeling every day. But I do really think that a regional plan could happen today. And I hope so. And you know, when I came to Israel to build this amazing project of I24 News, all the journalists ask me, what is your keyword? My keyword is coexistence. And if today you want to move in the Middle East, you need to move in coexistence. I remember the newspaper Yediot Aharonot, who is a very famous one. I gave my first interview, and I explained I wanted to build an international network with Israelis and Palestinians working together and delivering the news everywhere in the world. The headline was the most craziest guy with the most craziest project. I'm happy that 5 years after, I'm here in front of you as the CEO of I24 News, and I'm proud to tell you that we have a unique newsroom with 400 people in Tel Aviv, where you have Jewish people, Muslim, Druze, Christian. I think we can find some agnostic also, not only working together every day, but producing together the same content. That means we are able to build something together. That means coexistence is possible. And if today we have that perception that nothing is possible and everything is stuck, it's because I think the presentation that the media are doing in the world. So I think I have my 5 minutes. I just want to quote David Ben-Gurion, who used to say that anyone who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. So I think it's about time to believe in miracles. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Robin Wright is a multi-award-winning journalist and author who has reported from over 140 countries, including on the ground in the Middle East. Robin, delighted to hear your insights from reporting in the Middle Eastern war zone.
Thank you. I've actually covered every war, uprising, and revolution in the Middle East since the 1973 war. So I want to talk about two conflicts and then one broader principle. And I have both bad news and good news. I'll begin with the good news. Multilateralism is at work in Syria. The problem is you have rival multilateralisms. You have Turkey, Russia, and Iran and the Astana process trying to figure out how to solve or come up with a formula to end the Syrian civil war and ensure that President Assad stays in power. And you have the United States, the Europeans, and some Mideast countries, a rival process that was announced in a more formal way last week during the opening of the UN General Assembly. And the problem is getting these two multilateral processes to coordinate and come up with common principles. Until the international community does, the danger is that the Syrian civil war doesn't really end. The reality is that President Assad probably is more vulnerable in peacetime than he is even in war. And the twilight zone in between, retaking huge chunks of the territory and actually restoring Syrian sovereignty is huge. And that's why multilateralism will be so important in resolving this conflict. The dangers to Assad, and this is where the international community will have to play a big role, is that he will reassume control of a country with $400 billion of destruction, where the political flashpoints that triggered the Arab Spring haven't been resolved, where the majority of the population still feels marginalized. The international community can only have so much influence, but it will take their agreement to fully come up with a solution to solve Syria, or the danger is that Syria is even more unstable for another decade, and that Syria isn't even to hold together as a state as we've assumed it in its current borders. There are serious dangers that Syria's borders erode. The danger also, particularly to Israel, is that Syria has become the proxy battleground in its rivalry for influence in the region or for stability in the region with Iran. Israel, I think, is engaged in over 200 airstrikes on Syrian territory. Iran is now, primarily on Iranian targets, Iran is now deploying missiles, trying to replicate its buildup of Hezbollah in Lebanon, now in Syria, and that widens the vulnerability of Israel. The second conflict I wanted to address is Iran. 10 days ago, I spent an evening with President Rouhani of Iran when he was at the UN General Assembly, and on Saturday I had 2 sessions with its foreign ministers. The interesting thing is that multilateralism is still at play in dealing with the Iran nuclear issue and the wider array of problems. One of the things that was so striking about the UN this year was the language from both President Trump and President Rouhani, that for all the anger that has been expressed publicly by both men, Trump actually tweeted the morning of his session chairing the Security Council, that he wasn't going to meet Rouhani this time, maybe in the future. And then he said, he's probably an absolutely lovely guy. Absolutely lovely guy. I mean, the Iranians were in shock. The Iranians also were very open to talking to the United States. And President Rouhani said he didn't think there was any problem that couldn't be resolved through dialogue. And Zarif described dealing with the United States with the movie 50 First Dates, which is the Adam Sandler movie where he's dating a woman who has amnesia, and every day he has a date with her, and they start from scratch. He said, this is what it's like. But he also said that Iran was still willing to talk. Now, needless to say, they have vastly different agendas. But the principle established through multilateral negotiations through the JCPOA is still alive. Maybe barely, but it's still alive. I wanted to close with one quick thought, and that is why I'm optimistic about the region long term. I think the factors that triggered the Arab Spring can be celebrated. The fact that you have the majority of the population in the region is now educated, and that includes its girls. The fact that that because of that education, that people have a greater sense of the world, the change in the world, the rights of the individual. And that because of technology, they have an ability to circumvent state control. 20 years ago, Al Jazeera was founded. It was the first independent satellite station that could circumvent state control. Today, there are over 500 independent satellite television stations in the Middle East. It just shows you that there is no longer one truth, one idea. The problem, of course, is that the kids who were behind the Arab Spring didn't have the resources, the maturity, the experience, the political parties, or an idea about what they could create as an alternative. So we've seen the beginning of a process that the international community initially supported, didn't know how to offer direction as well, but will play a role as this young generation grows into the political space, and because they are the majority, will increasingly shape the future of these countries. I think there's hope down the road, so I don't think we have to totally despair of the world's most volatile region.
Thank you, Robin. Dr. Muzaffar Olimov is a professor of history at the Tajik State National University. Dr. Olimov, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer of this forum and especially Dialogue of Civilization to invite me here. Maybe in this our session panel, maybe it is very strange why I am here. I am from Tajikistan. Tajikistan, one of the Muslim republic of Central Asia, former Soviet republics. I prepared some, I would only comment some slides during my presentation, because the full text of my presentation, publish it in volume, just publish it, Dialogue Civilization. That's why I thank my colleague, Professor Voloshenko, and if you're interested in this subject more detailed, you may read this book, this is my paper. But according to this panel session, I would like to explain that in comparison with the Middle East region, the religious situation in Central Asia countries is calm. However, there are thousands of militants from Central Asia who continue fighting in the Middle East. And in recent years, Central Asians have been involved in the terrorist attacks in Istanbul, New York, St. Petersburg, Stockholm, and other cities. It is noteworthy that we have seen more attacks by Central Asian outside the region than within it. A single exception is when in the August, 4 tourists were killed in an Islamic State inspired attack in southern Tajikistan. Some have been quick to label Central Asia as a growing hotbed in Islamic extremism and exported of terrorism. Returning fighters from Syria and Iraq, spillover from Afghanistan, and homegrown terrorists are all framed as a threat to the region. Nevertheless, the most experts in Central Asia believe that the talk about the hotbed of Islamic extremists in Central Asia is pointless, although there are many reasons for concern. If you see this slide, Tajikistan population only 9 million. But nevertheless, fighters from Tajikistan presented in Syria and Iraq, according to some information, official information, around 1,300. But for case Tajikistan is very huge figure in comparative with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Uzbekistan. And you know that after just collapse of Soviet Union, in Tajikistan was civic war. One of the sides, our conflict side was political Islam. And during our civic war, one of the main figure side was Islamic Revival Party. And it was maybe in some point of view, just after collapse of Soviet Union, it was very interesting phenomena, and it's very interesting experience when included to political processes just after our conflict, included Islamic Revival Party up to 2015. In 2015, Tajikistan was coup d'etat, and Islamic Party was stopped his activity in Tajikistan last 3 years. That's why maybe this phenomenon must be studied, must be in perspective will be studied, but experience of coexisting political Islam in case of Central Asia former Soviet countries. It's very interesting phenomena. But in another side, in nowadays, at present situation, it is stopping this activity. But some of activists of Islamic Party now moving to European countries, in Afghanistan. That's why it's a very interesting phenomena for study, for research. Thank you. Right. Maybe I continue for another questions when you will be done for us.
Great, thank you. Dr. Alimov, thank you very much. Our final speaker is Dr. Ariel Cohen, expert on international security and energy policy and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Cohen.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me better than I hear the other speakers. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Yakunin and the Dialogue of Civilizations for inviting me, and it's also a particular honor to be on the panel with former Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Olmert. I am looking at the Middle East right now from the point of view of the foreign involvement of the great powers in the Middle East, of Russia and the United States. When I was in Moscow a few months ago, the news of the United States potentially delivering a strike, which the United States did deliver, to Syria, raised a chatter, more than a chatter, raised serious concern in Moscow that Russia may retaliate not just against the missiles, the Tomahawk missiles that would be sent into Syria by the US Navy, but even against the ships. And I said, guys, what are you talking about? You're going to be sinking the US 6th Fleet ships in the Mediterranean? Are you serious? And the Russians said, yes. And I said, why? What are the vital national interests of Russia in Syria and more broadly in the Middle East? What are the vital national interests of the United States in the Middle East? That's a question a practitioner and an analyst of international relations would always ask himself or herself. In my analysis, ladies and gentlemen, with the rise of the shale oil and gas in the United States, with the United States being now the #1 producer of oil and gas in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia and Russia, with the decline of oil and gas in general as an industry in a very foreseeable future, I now drive a car that requires 0 gasoline. And drives, half of the time it drives itself, by the way. It's a Tesla. With the gasoline declining over the next 30 years, oil is no longer the vital national interest as it was during the 2 Arab embargoes and the Kuwait War, the first Gulf War. It is no longer a vital national interest for the United States. Russia has an abundance of oil and gas. In fact, it doesn't know what to do with its gas. So what is it? For the United States, it is more or less support of the status quo. We are a status quo power. So it would be a support of our great allies, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council members, Egypt, Israel, etc. For Russia, it would be less tangible but nevertheless very important things, such as coming back to the Middle East as great power after a quarter of a century absence. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, for the first time in 150 years, Russia was no longer at least a competitor for influence. You know, in the 19th century, it was Great Britain challenged by Russia, France, and Germany. After World War II, it was the United States replaced Great Britain, challenged by the Soviet Union quite successfully. If you look at the allies of the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Nasser, etc., quite a success, but not the only dominant power. So what is it today? Let's take Turkey. Turkey is almost Middle East, right? So Turkey, the joke I heard recently for the United States, it's an ally and not a partner. For Russia, it's a partner and not an ally. So with Turkey, you have $21 billion Akkuyu nuclear project, 4 reactors. You have the Turkish Stream gas pipeline. You have S-400 missiles. So, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, you start talking about some real money in energy and weapons. And you detach Turkey from the Western alliance with Mr. Erdogan quite happy to play along. You work with Iran to undermine American allies. You create this Washington jargon A to AD, A to AD, anti-access, anti-access what? Anti-access and defense envelope with all the missiles, and just in Syria we saw the other day S-300 has been delivered after Israel was blamed for the Syrians shooting down a Russian reconnaissance plane. So you build military presence, you can threaten American allies, you work closely with Saudi Arabia to create OPEC Plus, an organization that will be capable of controlling the oil prices more than OPEC itself. Russia plus Saudi Arabia plus Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and others is much bigger actor in the oil market than the traditional OPEC. Having said that, to paraphrase Bismarck, the Middle East is not worth the life of one Russian Spetsnaz soldier and one American Green Beret. There are no vital national interests. If Middle East, God forbid, disappeared into a black hole tomorrow, US and Russia could continue not just living but thriving. Thank you very much. So then the question is, how do you manage your differences? And the answer is very, very carefully. If you take essentially a defensive position, US defending its interest, Russia defending its interest, but you're not engaged in offensive operation, when a Russian private military contractor marches towards the US-controlled troops, military zone, and gets smacked. I'm talking, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Wagner private military company. When you watch how you fly your reconnaissance planes, when you are careful not to support jihadis as freedom fighters in the fight against Assad, when you recognize that the Assad regime is, as colleagues here said already, is a regime that caused death of hundreds of thousands of their fellow citizens and caused 7 to 10 million refugees to leave their own country. When you do that and you manage the post-Assad transition and you work together, you can achieve quite a lot without inadvertently or intentionally sliding to conflict. I already mentioned the pre-World War I situation in which the Balkans were the area that drew other powers that did not have vital national interest into a first global conflagration, World War I. Germany and Russia did not have vital national interest in the Balkans. They went there to support the Allies, Russia to support Serbia, and Germany to support Austro-Hungary. Austro-Hungary was the one who actually triggered the war by declaring war on Serbia, and it was all downhill from there, as you know. We cannot afford to turn the Middle East today into the new Balkans. And as much as I like to believe that multilateralism is the solution, I still believe that it is the great power national interest will eventually define, whether or not we, God forbid, have a major war in the Middle East. But beyond that, the conflict that we mentioned, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the conflict in the Yemen, containing Iran's nuclear ambition, all that is solvable, manageable, and hopefully when we meet here next time, next year, 2 years, 3 years from now, we will be able to mark real progress in these conflicts. I would add something else. The United States and Russia actually do share a major confluence of interest, and that is fighting the radical brand of the Sunni Islam, the political Islam. Very little was accomplished in cooperation. Some special services, intelligence services, and law enforcement cooperation did take place. Some terrorist attacks were avoided. But beyond that, there was no serious joint action. It is my hope that we will have a clearer vision of what the real interests are, what are the areas for cooperation, and where are the areas of friction that both sides need to step away from. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers. One of the challenges in trying to address problems in the Middle East is that there isn't just one of them. And any particular conflict you try to address will have multiple problems, and there are trade-offs. If you want to uphold the principle of state integrity and the inviolability of borders, that will require, for example, trampling on the rights of self-determination of the Kurds. If we want stability, that comes at the trade-off possibly of allowing the rule of a dictator to run his country. There are trade-offs, and being realistic about solutions means having to accept that there are trade-offs between different solutions. So Mr. Olmert, my question to you is that when international policymakers look at the Middle East, not just Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, the situation in Yemen, in Kurdistan, in Iraq, in Syria, how should they begin trying to address those trade-offs between stability, the inviolability of borders, human rights? Because whatever solution they find is not going to make all the problems going to go away. They will only make some problems go away and perhaps highlight other ones.
Well, I definitely think that what we consider to be the superpowers of the major countries, in our days maybe the only two major political powers that are recognized by the international community are the Russians and the Americans. But I think that there are many things which they can do. And if I understood well, you say that maybe a collaboration between America and Russia can be of significance in solving some of the problems. So at least I'd like to suggest that as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we don't need the Russians and we don't need the Americans. And if we don't need them. I dealt with it, and I negotiated with them, and I achieved more when I didn't have the Americans telling me what to do and the Russians advising me what to do, because nothing that the two sides will not agree with will never happen. And the myth that it depends on the superpowers, or if we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even about the greater Arab powers to influence, moderate Arab powers to influence, for instance, the Palestinians, it's a misconception, it's a mistake. And you can take an example from what happened in the second Camp David in 2000, when the President of the United States of America begged Yasser Arafat, begged him, used every power of persuasion that he possessed, promised him the Garden of Eden, threatened him of depriving him of everything, asking him to agree to conclude an agreement with Barak, and Yasser Arafat said no, and nothing happened to him. The power of the power of persuasion of the superpowers is much more limited than most of us want to believe. However, I said, and I'm optimistic, that an agreement can be achieved. It can be achieved if the two sides will come to the inevitable conclusion that it serves their long-range interests. I think that a greater number of Israelis that believe so, that an agreement on the basis of what I proposed is not only is achievable and is acceptable, but is beneficial to the long-range interest of Israel. I think that the Palestinians now recognize it just as well. But the leaderships of the two nations, as I said before, are reluctant to take the risk. And there can be no peace and no progress and no solution without a courageous leadership that is prepared to risk their position for the sake of achieving a greater goal for their people. So that's for one issue in the Middle East. You asked about the possible trade-offs. There can be trade-offs, but the question is, it may have been more relevant in a different time. I think that what the United States projects in the last few years, and particularly now under the leadership of Donald Trump, and this is a matter of opinion. You know, one can agree with it, one can disagree with it, one can criticize it, one can hail Trump for his bold leadership. It's a matter of opinion. But I think it's quite clear that America has ceased to play a dominant role in the Middle East as it used to be in the past, and it's fading out. And into this vacuum, very skillfully, the Russian president, who is a very skillful and very able and a very determined person, to the extent that I can judge him from a personal relationships, I think he is penetrating into a much more influential position. So I don't think that he is so much interested in trade-offs. I don't think that Donald Trump, strangely enough, is interested in trade-offs, because he has a very straightforward position of pulling out and maybe in line with the historical position of separation that characterized American foreign policy in the 20th century after the First World War. And therefore, I don't quite see an option for trade-offs that can be helpful and useful for solving some of the issues that are now bothering the Middle East. And I want to say one final sentence. I'm not happy with some of the steps taken by Russia and by President Putin, certainly not the introduction of the S-300 to Syria as of the last few days. I discussed this issue with President Putin many times in the past, and I think that that's at least what he told others, that I convinced him not to provide the S-300 neither to Syria nor to Iran, which he didn't until recently to Iran and now to Syria. But I still think that even though I don't like some of the steps, and even though I think that Putin has certainly decided to exercise the opportunity provided to him by the absence of a serious American presence in the Middle East in order to increase his influence and his presence in certain areas in a much more significant manner than it used to be, I think that he knows the limits and that he will not cross limits which might put the entire Middle East into a turbulence which may destabilize the situation in a very dangerous manner. So I don't like some of the steps of Russia. I'm not happy with certain measures taken by the Russians. I think that they should have prevented Iran from positioning their military units in Syria in the first place. But I do think, based on my acquaintance with Putin, that he has defined the borders and the limits, and that he will, within these limits, he will try to maximize the benefits for Russia without risking total destabilization.
Robin, Mr. Olmert raises a very interesting point here where he says that the Western powers are not only becoming less involved on the ground in the Middle East, but have a lot less influence than they think they have. This morning, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to two activists who'd struggled against the use of rape in warfare, one of whom was an incredibly brave woman, Nadia Murad, who was a Yazidi victim of ISIS sex slavery, bringing back, I think, into public consciousness that horrendous genocide and the way in which the West, I think, failed that particular minority in Iraq. And so with many of the Middle Eastern countries lying in tatters, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and with what Mr. Olmert said here about the West having less influence than it thinks it has, and so much of the power being in the hands of the local leaders, what does that suggest about the international community's ability to prompt these countries towards more peaceful solutions, towards some representative government, institutions, human rights, or are we truly at the mercy of those particular leaders with all the power really being in their hands, leaving minorities in particular danger?
Well, first let me just say that the U.S. Senate may get it wrong, but the Nobel Peace Prize Committee got it right. So, yes, there's no question that the mood in the United States is very much not to get involved. We've been burned in Iraq, particularly. I think most every poll now indicates the majority of Americans believe the Iraq war was not either justified or carried out correctly or has failed to deliver what we wanted. And that's led to a dramatic mood change in the United States. Throw in Afghanistan, our longest war, and there's a real reticence. There's a lot of angry rhetoric about another war, this one with Iran. I think the administration would much rather see some kind of action by protesters inside Iran to do the dirty work for them. I think that's unrealistic. I think that there's a lot of talk. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that Iran is on the cusp. I don't think they're there yet. I think it's wishful thinking. And so it gets down to what can the U.S. do to, whether it's help create democratic change and turmoil in Libya, Yemen, contain autocratic leaders in Egypt, and particularly at a time when the U.S. is reducing its foreign aid, and aid was always a source of soft power, and something that we could say, look, we will help you, whether it's with job creation or democracy promotion, creating civil society, that we had the tools, and with the change in the public opinion about how much we want to get involved in any part of the world, but particularly the Middle East, with the reduction in aid, with this period of withdrawal, the United States just doesn't want, the American public just doesn't want to get engaged, and so that limits us a great deal. The Russians have been very creative, very manipulative in some ways in terms of understanding how to work the Americans, what the Americans would tolerate or not at least stand up to prevent, has given, I think, the Russians an edge in some places, but de facto, because the U.S. hasn't done that much. And I think that's going to be the reality for some time to come. I think the U.S. wants to try multilateralism, try as it's doing with Syria to create alternatives. I think that's very unrealistic. It's too late in the day. I think the United States, the Europeans, and the Sunni Arab states are going to have very little influence for the foreseeable future on Syria. But, you know.
Ariel, Robin here is saying that these countries, the United States at least, that doesn't want to get involved militarily in the Middle East. And you were saying before that if both Russia and the United States are serious about it, neither of them has vital interests. But all the same, it's interesting when we heard the debate within the West. Can you hear me? The debate within the West about intervention in Syria when the civil war began. It was almost a debate about whether there should be intervention or not be intervention. And the debate wasn't about whether we should intervene, and if we don't intervene, then Russia is going to intervene. There was going to be intervention in the Syrian civil war one way or the other. Do you think then that the lesson of Syria within the United States, within the West more broadly, is going to be pro-intervention because they realize it isn't possible to sit it out? If we sit it out, we're granting a strategic place on the map to our biggest rivals.
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more with Prime Minister Olmert that bold leadership really matters. For example, Prime Minister Olmert took a decision to destroy a Syrian nuclear reactor, and I fully applaud you, sir, because it was a real, vital, and immediate threat for the survival of the State of Israel when Assad worked with North Koreans to build, I believe it was a plutonium reactor, is that correct? Yes. So, but can we applaud at the same time to the late Prime Minister Sharon for pulling out of Gaza and in Gaza within 1 year, 2 years, a Hamas takeover took place? I don't know. I think there are different opinions about that. So there is time for bold leadership. There is time for careful policy management. That was a platitude. But I would say that Mr. Trump is sending all kinds of crisscross signals about the Middle East. On the one hand, the talk about Iran pulling out of JCPOA, bad-mouthing the Iranian leadership sounds very strong. And next day you read that the carrier battle group is steaming out of the Persian Gulf in the face of Iranian threat to close the Strait of Hormuz to oil exports, pulling out the Patriot batteries. What is that about? I'll tell you what is that about. The real concern in the United States today, as the current director of the CIA just announced recently, talking about CIA priorities, is no longer terrorism. It's nation states. Translate, China and Russia. In that order. It's not Russia and China, it's China and Russia. The carrier battle group is needed in the Pacific, and the Patriot missiles either in Europe or in the Pacific, not in the Persian Gulf. What is the message to the Iranians? And I think we had a senior general, I don't remember if it was a CENTCOM commander. Robin, did you see that? A senior general yesterday saying the goal of the United States is not regime change in Iran. But this is...
The administration said that too. Several of them have said that.
And the administration said it too. But other people in the administration, if you go to Nikki Haley and say, Nikki, is our goal to regime change in Iran? She'll probably say yes. So who in the administration? What are the real goals? What is the Middle East policy? Yes, we can sort of carry on and cruise on support of Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc. But I do not sense a real guiding principles and shared threat assessment with our allies, and that worries me a lot.
Frank Malul, here on the panel we've been challenging some of the perceptions about the Middle East, trying to think a little bit more creatively about ways to address those challenges. And of course the media are enormously responsible for how foreign publics, foreign politicians understand conflicts, perhaps by adopting a certain narrative and sticking to it, and then perhaps never re-challenging that narrative because it's easier to keep on telling the same story, and a story that so many people are familiar with. Do you think that media, press and newspapers have the space, especially within today's world where people have such short attention spans, to seriously resubject conflicts and problems to fresh thinking and change the conversation rather than sustaining the same tired tropes and assumptions that accompany all these discussions?
It's a big issue. It's a very big issue. When I was talking about perception, I wanted to speak also about the new geopolitics in the region. We have the geopolitics of the emotions. And the emotions in the Middle East, you have or humiliation in one side, or you have hope in the other side. If you want to move, you need to create hope everywhere. And when you want to see the Middle East as a solution, you need not only to talk about conflicts. You can talk about innovation, you can talk about high-tech, you can talk about health, and you can see that a lot of things are discovered in the Middle East, and especially in Israel. But it's interesting when I'm working with the other CEO of the networks, like BBC or Fox, CNN, France 24, Russia Today or Deutsche Welle. They all have our own narrative because, first, most of the international news channels today are belonging to government, except I24 News. We are the only one and first independent news channel in the Middle East. France 24 is belonging to the French government, Russia Today to Putin, BBC to the British government. So they are telling the narrative of their own government, like Voice of America, Al Jazeera, or other networks who are sponsored by political parties. So it's very difficult to be objective. And in I24, what we are using with the journalists is not to be objective. We don't believe in objectivity. We believe on truth. And the truth is to put facts on table and to give the opportunity to everyone to speak. The global picture is to deliver the global story, not only focus at the end of the story or at the middle of the story. There is always a beginning and there is always an end. So I really think that today with the digital, the social media and all these kind of things, it will change. It will change, but it's also dangerous because everybody can put the story what he wants to do. But the responsibility of the journalist, and we have here on stage very professional journalists, and it's very important to always focus on the global picture, and maybe it will help the population to change their emotions.
I want to thank everyone on our panel. We've had a very interesting discussion. People with experience from a whole range of fields, from the height of government, reporting on the ground in war zones, media, academia, business. And so we've had a very interesting discussion trying to unpack some of the manifold conflicts in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Syria, the situation in Iraq as well, trying to address what those problems are and perhaps what room the international community has to explore solutions, whether those solutions exist, and the extent to which the international community, as Mr. Olmert said, even has the power and that influence to impose its will, even if it wants to. So on behalf of Alexei and myself, I'd like to give everyone on our panel a big round of applause. Thank you.